They laughed when he planted rye. Across his best field, it fixed the soil and fed 4 seasons free. The summer of 1987 broke early in Kossuth County, Iowa. It broke hot and stayed that way through July. The corn was in by late May, same as always. The soybeans were in by the first week of June. Merle Duval had done it the same way for 31 years, the same way his father had done it for 27 years before him, and the same way most every other farmer on that stretch of road between Algona and Sway City had done it since the 40s. Disc it. Follow it. Plant it. Pull what you can from it. Merle was 58 years old. The farm covered 340 acres. He'd watched 180 of those acres slowly quit on him. Not all at once. That wasn't how it worked. It happened the way a tire loses pressure. You don't notice the first few pounds. You notice when you're riding flat. The county extension agent had come out in June of that year. Gerald Foss had been the Kossuth County extension agent for 9 years. He walked the south field with Merle on a Tuesday morning, both of them looking at the same pail. Cracked ground. The corn was in. Technically, it was growing. Technically, Foss crouched down and pressed his thumb into the soil near a row. The soil didn't give. Dry an inch down. Gray at the surface. The color of old ash. Foss said the soil organic matter was below 2%. Said it had been dropping for a decade. Said at the current rate of erosion, Merle was losing about a half-inch of topsoil every 2 years. Said there were programs available. Merle thanked him for coming out. Foss left a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Printed handouts about fertilizer schedules and irrigation timing and soil amendment programs available through the USDA. Merle's wife, Loretta, moved them to the counter. Neither of them looked at them again. The yield that year was 94 bushels per acre. County average was 118. Merle's best field, the North Field, 60 acres of ground his father had broken in 1951, came in at 107. The South Field, the 120 acres that had been worked hardest, came in at 81. It had yielded 113 in 1971. That gap was the thing Merle couldn't stop thinking about, not the absolute number, the distance between what it had been and what it was. He sat at the kitchen table on the last evening of August, the combine still muddy from the morning run, the grain elevator receipt folded in his shirt pocket, and he did the math on a yellow legal pad. At 81 bushels per acre on a 120 acres, he was leaving behind roughly $19,000 compared to where that ground should be performing. Every year, on top of his input costs, on top of the machinery payment to the John Deere dealer in Algona, on top of the crop insurance premium that had gone up twice in 3 years. The legal pad had 3 columns: revenue, expenses, gap. The gap column was the longest. 3 days later, Merle drove to the county library in Algona, spent 2 hours in the periodicals section reading agricultural journals from 1981 to 1986. He was not a man who spent time in libraries. Loretta knew something was different when he came home with 4 pages of handwritten notes and asked her to keep dinner warm. He'd been reading about cover crops. Not the USDA handouts on Loretta's counter. Not the extension pamphlets. He'd found a monograph from a researcher at Purdue University named Clifton Brower, who had been running field trials since 1979 on continuous grain cropping systems versus winter cover crop rotations. Brower's data was not complicated. Fields that went bare over winter lost topsoil at 6 times the rate of fields with ground cover. Bare soil crusted. Rain hit it directly, broke the surface aggregates, carried the fine particles away in sheet flow. Over 10 years, the organic matter loss in bare fallow plots averaged 0.31% per year. Fields planted to winter rye after fall harvest lost almost none. The rye grew through October and November. It went dormant in December. came back in March. Root systems 6 inches deep, sometimes 8, holding the soil against spring thaw runoff. The organic matter in the rye trial plots had actually increased, not by much, hundredths of a percent per year. But the direction was reversed. Merle's south field had been going the wrong direction for 15 years. He called Brower's office at Purdue on a Friday morning in September, got a secretary, left his name and number. Brower called back on a Tuesday. They talked for 45 minutes. Merle had his yellow legal pad out. Brower walked him through the protocol. Plant winter rye at 90 to 100 pounds per acre after corn harvest. Let it overwinter. Terminate it in spring with a roller crimper or herbicide 4 weeks before planting. Plant corn or soybeans into the terminated rye mulch. Leave the residue on the surface. Don't till. Merle asked how long before the soil recovered. Brower said 3 years to see measurable improvement, 5 years to see significant recovery, 8 to 10 years to see the full difference. Merle was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what a 100-pound bag of winter rye seed cost. Around $14, Brower said. At 90 pounds per acre, roughly $12.60 per acre to plant the cover crop. Merle thanked him, hung up, sat at the kitchen table. He did the math again. $12.60 per acre on 120 acres was $1,512. 1 year. If it worked, and he recovered even half the yield gap over 5 years, the return was better than $9,000 annually. The inputs were seed and fuel. The cover crop would suppress some weed pressure, which would reduce herbicide costs. The organic matter improvement would reduce synthetic nitrogen needs over time. Brower had data on nitrogen from the rye residue. The decomposing rye mulch released nitrogen slowly into the soil profile through the growing season. Brower called it slow-release nitrogen. He'd seen it cut synthetic nitrogen applications by 20 to 30% in mature cover crop systems. Merle wrote that number down, circled it. He told Loretta that evening at dinner. She listened without interrupting. Asked one question. Would the rye need to be harvested or just terminated? Just terminated, Merle said. It was a cover crop, not a grain crop. You planted it, it grew, it held the soil, and in spring you killed it and planted through it. Loretta said it sounded like planting a field just to kill it. Merle said that was about right. She asked if it would work. He said he didn't know yet. The county co-op in Sway City didn't stock winter rye seed in the fall of 1987. They stocked alfalfa, clover, oats, not winter rye. The co-op manager, Dennis Coles, had been running the location for 7 years. He told Merle that nobody in Kossuth County was planting winter rye on their corn ground, said it was a cover crop, which meant it generated no revenue, which meant it was a cost with no payback. Said Merle was looking at $13 an acre to cover 120 acres, and at the end of it, he'd have a field full of dead rye to deal with before he could even plant. Merle asked where he could get the seed. Coles said he could order it from a supplier in Des Moines. 3-week lead time. Merle said that was fine. The order came in on October 14, 1987, 11 bags of winter rye. 100-pound bags, 1,100 pounds total for 120 acres at roughly 9 pounds per acre. Merle had miscalculated slightly. He needed 90 pounds per acre, not 9. He called the co-op back. Coles ordered 90 more bags. Total cost, $5 times $40 for the seed order plus $62 in delivery. While he was waiting, he drove to the elevator in Algona and asked around. 3 farmers at the elevator that week. He mentioned the cover crop. All 3 had the same reaction, not hostile. Puzzled. Why would you plant something you're going to kill? Why would you put any money into a field that's not going to produce a sellable crop this year? Why would you take that 120 acres out of production for a whole winter on the chance it might improve yield in 3 or 4 years? Merle didn't argue with any of them. Said he'd been watching the South Field decline for 15 years, and he wanted to try something different. One of the farmers, a man named Paul Rickman, who farmed 600 acres east of Whittemore, said it straight. Said Merle was throwing good money after bad. Said if the soil was worn out, the answer was more inputs, not less. Said the extension programs existed for exactly this situation. Said there was a cost-share program through the USDA that would pay for part of a synthetic fertilizer amendment plan. Merle said he was aware of the programs. Rickman said there was nothing in the agronomic literature that supported cover cropping in a commercial corn-soybean rotation. Merle said Brower's work was in the agronomic literature, specifically the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation from 1985. Rickman didn't respond to that. Left a few minutes later. The seed arrived in 2 deliveries. The second truck came on October 28, 1987, 2 weeks after corn harvest. The ground was cold. October in Kossuth County meant overnight lows in the 30s. Rye needed soil temperatures above 34 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. Merle checked the forecast. Had about a week. He used the International Harvester drill his father had bought in 1963. It still ran. He'd replaced the disc openers twice and rebuilt the seed metering unit once in 1979. The drill seeded at 3 miles per hour. At that speed, 120 acres took 28 hours of field time. He ran it over 2 days. October 30th and 31st, 1987, the seed went in at 90 to 95 pounds per acre depending on the run. Merle tracked it with a notebook in the cab. Row by row across the south field, the Ish drill turning the same ground he'd been working since 1957. The rye seed was small, lighter than corn, lighter than soybeans. It fell into the soil, and he couldn't tell, looking back over the field, whether anything had changed. He told himself it hadn't. Not yet. The rye emerged on November 12th, 13 days after planting. Merle drove out in the truck on a gray Wednesday morning and walked the south field looking at the thin green fuzz coming up across the soil surface. 3 inches. Uniform, the whole 120 acres showing new growth. He stood in the middle of the south field for a while. The ground was soft under his boots in a way it hadn't been in years. Not wet soft, just yielding. The rye roots were already working. He went back to the house and made coffee. Winter came hard in December of 1987. Temperatures dropped below 0 on 9 separate days. The rye went dormant in mid-December, under an inch of ice and 2 inches of snow. Merle checked it twice through January. Drove to the edge of the field and looked out over the white-covered ground. Nothing visible. The rye was alive under there, or it wasn't. It came back on March 8, 1988, 2 days after the first real thaw. The south field turned green before any of the surrounding fields started showing growth. Not a dramatic green, a faint early spring green that you had to be looking for. Merle was looking for it. By April 1st, the rye stood 14 inches tall. It had grown through March against freezing nights and a late frost on March 23rd that had put ice on the windshield of the truck. The rye didn't care about the frost. Winter rye was bred for exactly that. Merle had planned to terminate the rye with a roller crimper. He'd welded one himself over the winter using plans from a Pennsylvania extension publication. A drum, 5 feet wide, with welded chevron ribs that would crimp and kill the rye stalks without incorporating them into the soil. He'd spent 14 hours in the shop building it. It worked on the test pass. He walked behind the tractor and watched the crimped rye stalks lying flat, still green, with the chevron crimp marks running every 8 inches along the stalks. The rye died over the following 10 days, not immediately. Slowly, the crimped stalks turned from green to yellow to brown. The mulch layer formed. By April 20th, the south field was covered in a 4-inch mat of dead rye residue. The surface was completely covered, no bare soil visible. Merle planted corn on April 22, 1988, into the rye mulch, without tillage. He used the planter modified with coulters to cut through the residue. It worked, mostly. Some rows had heavier mulch. Some patches the planter struggled. He made note of every problem row in the notebook. The corn emerged on May 3rd, 11 days after planting. It didn't look different that year. Merle wasn't expecting it to look different. Brower had said 3 years. He was at year 1. The yield on the south field in 1988 came in at 83 bushels per acre, 2 bushels above the previous year. Merle recorded it in the ledger without comment. He was not measuring this in single-year increments. He planted winter rye again in October of 1988. On 120 acres of south field, same protocol. $1,602 for seed and delivery. Same itch drill. Same 28 hours of field time over 2 days. Paul Rickman stopped by the elevator in November of 1988 and asked how the cover crop experiment had gone. Merle said it was going, said he'd plant it again for the 2nd year. Rickman said he'd heard and asked if the yield had improved. Merle said 2 bushels. Rickman said 2 bushels didn't cover the seed cost. Merle said he was aware of the math. He was also aware that the math was short-term. He didn't say that, just nodded and paid for his elevator fee. The winter of 1988 to 1989 was wet. More snow than the previous year. More runoff in February and March. Merle drove along the fence line on the east side of the south field in late February and compared it to the bare fallow field across the road, which belonged to Rickman. The ditch on Rickman's side had brown water running in it. Topsoil. You could see it in the color of the water after a thaw. The ditch on Merle's side had clear water. He wrote that down in the notebook, too. The 1989 corn crop on the south field yielded 91 bushels per acre, 8 bushels above his 1987 baseline, 7 above 1986, still 27 bushels below the county average. But the direction had changed. Merle was now certain of the direction. Gerald Foss, the extension agent, drove by unannounced in June of 1989, said he'd heard Merle had been cover cropping the south field. Asked if he could walk it. Merle took him out. Foss crouched down near the corn rows and pressed his thumb into the ground the same way he had in 1987. The soil gave this time. An inch, then resistance. Still not what it should be, but different from what it had been. Foss asked how much the seed cost annually. Merle told him. Foss wrote it down. Didn't say whether he thought it was worthwhile. Asked if he could send a soil sample to the extension lab for organic matter testing. Merle said yes. The results came back 6 weeks later. Organic matter on the south field, 1.9%. In 1987, it had been below 2.0%. Not a large change. Foss said the number itself wasn't significant. What was significant was the trend line. 2 years ago, the number was declining. Now it was stable or slightly climbing. Foss said it was too early to draw conclusions. Merle said he was drawing them anyway. 3rd year. October 1989. Rye went in on the same schedule. 3rd winter. 3rd spring termination and no-till corn planting. The yield that year was 102 bushels per acre, 19 above the 1987 baseline. The input costs had changed too. Merle had reduced his nitrogen application by 15% after Brower had told him the decomposing rye was contributing roughly 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. At 18 cents per pound of nitrogen in 1989, that was a $4 to $5 per acre reduction in fertilizer cost. On 120 acres, roughly $540 saved that year on nitrogen alone. He subtracted $540 from the seed cost. Net cost of the cover crop program, about $1,100 for the third year. The yield improvement at 19 bushels per acre on 120 acres at the 1989 corn price of $2.36 per bushel was $5,382 in additional revenue compared to 1987. He showed the numbers to Loretta that evening, both columns. She looked at them for a moment, said the gap column was finally going the right direction. He planted rye in 1990, 1991, and 1992. Each year the same protocol. Each year the inputs got slightly more efficient as he learned the equipment modifications needed for no-till planting through the mulch. He added a second set of coulters to the planter in 1991. Cut the problem rows by 70%. Paul Rickman stopped by the farm in the fall of 1991. Not to ask about the cover crop. Said he had a question about the no-till planting equipment. His son had been reading some articles out of Iowa State about erosion control and had been asking about Merle's setup. Rickman didn't say his son was interested in cover crops. Said he was interested in no-till in general. Merle showed him the planter modifications. Let him take photographs. Rickman didn't say anything about the 2-bushel comment from 1988. The 1992 yield on the south field, 114 bushels per acre. 3 years earlier it had been 102. 5 years earlier it had been 81. The county average that year was 121. Merle was still below county average. But the gap had closed from 37 bushels to 7. Foss came back in the fall of 1992 with a new extension agent who had taken over half his territory. A younger man from Ames named Terry Gruber. Gruber was 3 years out of Iowa State. He and Foss walked the south field with Merle and pulled 3 soil cores with a probe Gruber brought in a metal case. The organic matter test came back at 2.4%, up from 1.9 in 1989, up from below 2.0 in 1987. Gruber said a 0.5% gain in 5 years was significant. Said it was the equivalent of roughly 30,000 pounds of organic material per acre added to the soil. Merle hadn't heard it described in those terms. 30,000 pounds per acre from a $12 seed investment and a dead plant. The compaction readings were different too. Gruber had a penetrometer. He ran it across 3 locations on the south field and 3 locations on the cornfield across the road that had been conventionally tilled. The south field penetration resistance was measurably lower at depths below 4 inches. Fewer hardpan layers. More consistent soil porosity. Gruber asked if Merle would be willing to let him run a more formal study using the south field as a comparison plot. Said he was writing his thesis on cover crop adoption in commercial grain operations, and Kossuth County was his study area. Said he needed a farmer who'd been doing this long enough to have a real data set. Merle said yes. Gruber's study ran from 1993 to 1996. 3 years of formal measurements. Soil cores every fall. Yield records from Merle's grain elevator tickets. Input receipts for seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel. The controls were Rickman's field, which had continued conventional tillage, and a third field belonging to a farmer named Hal Sundberg, who had been no-till for 4 years, but without cover crops. The numbers Gruber assembled over 3 years were not complicated. The south field had gained 0.18% organic matter per year over 5 years of cover cropping. The Rickman field had lost 0.09% per year. The Sundberg no-till field without cover crops had stayed nearly flat, losing 0.03% per year. The yield gap between Merle's South Field and the county average had closed from 37 bushels in 1987 to 5 bushels in 1994. The county average had also risen in that period, driven partly by new seed genetics, so the absolute comparison wasn't perfectly clean. Gruber accounted for it in his analysis. When he adjusted for the hybrid performance curve, the South Field had outperformed the expected trajectory for ground of its soil type by 18%. The nitrogen cost reduction had continued to build. By 1994, Merle was applying 30% less synthetic nitrogen than in 1987 on the same acres. Nitrogen prices had risen in that period. The actual dollar savings were better than the early estimates. He was saving roughly $9 per acre on nitrogen on the South Field annually. On a 120 acres, $1,080 per year. That was roughly 70% of the seed cost. The cover crop was paying for most of itself in nitrogen savings alone, without counting the yield improvement. Gruber presented his thesis at Iowa State in the spring of 1997. Merle didn't attend. He was planting. Gruber sent him a copy of the thesis in the mail, with a handwritten note on the title page that said the South Field data was the strongest long-term data set in the study. Merle read the methodology section and the results section, left the theory sections for later. Foss retired in 1995. At his retirement dinner at the Kossuth County Fairgrounds, he told a group of farmers and county officials that the single most instructive thing he'd seen in 9 years of extension work in the county was a man who planted a field just to kill it. Said it had taken him 3 years to understand what Merle was doing. Said he should have understood it from the soil test results in 1987. Merle was at the dinner. Didn't say anything about it. By 1996, 4 other farmers in Kossuth County were running winter cover crops. Not a large number. The county had 1,200 farm operations at the last census. 4 was less than 0.5%. But all 4 had asked Merle directly. He'd walked each of them through the planter modifications, told each of them what seed to order, where to order it, and what to expect in year 1 and year 2 when the numbers didn't yet justify the cost. He told them the cost didn't justify itself in year 1, told them it justified itself in year 5, and kept justifying itself indefinitely after that. Rickman started a cover crop trial on 40 acres in 1995. Merle saw the seed delivery truck at Rickman's place in late October. Didn't mention it the next time he saw Rickman at the elevator. Rickman didn't bring it up either. Merle Duval farmed the South Field through 2004. Retired that year at 75. Handed the operation to his son Dale, who had been farming with him since 1988. Dale had grown up watching the cover crop go in every October. Had run the drill on it himself since 1993. The organic matter on the South Field measured 3.1% in 2003. When Merle had walked it with Foss in 1987, it had been below 2.0. The field's yield in 2003 was 128 bushels per acre. County average that year was 131. The gap that had been 37 bushels in 1987 was 3 bushels in 2003. Dale kept planting winter rye every October. Same ground. Same IT drill, still running. Rebuilt again in 1998, and once more in 2002. Dale added 60 more acres to the cover crop program in 2005 when the North Field started showing the same early-stage compaction signs that the South Field had shown in the 1980s. He caught it earlier than Merle had. He knew what to look for. Merle drove past the farm on a November afternoon in 2007. Saw the South Field green and even with new winter rye 3 weeks out of the ground. Dale's truck was parked at the headland. Dale was walking the rows the same way Merle used to walk them in November, looking at the stand, checking the germination. He didn't stop, kept driving. The south field was still covered in rye, still holding.